Do you remember all those hundreds of thousands of kids, the unaccompanied minor children that went missing under the Biden administration? So my friend and fellow advocate Allie Hopper recently testified at the Committee for Homeland Security, and what I heard just floored me. So before I show you a video clip, I want to explain there's a hotline that these children could call if they were in trouble, if they needed help. And over 65,000 phone calls were made to this hotline, and they went unanswered. And that means that some of these children were being abused, and we know this for a fact. And those calls were left unanswered. Those children were left helpless.
Telling this committee that the Biden administration, while they were letting all of these unaccompanied minors into the country, and as we've talked about today, they weren't keeping track of them, they issued these kids a hotline that they could call. If they had trouble with the sponsor family that they were put with, and you're saying that 65,000 calls to this hotline designated to protect these kids went unanswered? Is that what you're telling this committee?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Look, I knew from my research, my reporting, and my trip to the border that children were being abused. And we know that the government has awarded millions of dollars to these NGOs that claim to be protecting these kids. And these government contracts, which were no bid, by the way, were handed out like candy. And we're talking about billions of dollars spent over the course of a small amount of years. And this Biden administration was supposed to protect these kids. And instead, they handed out these children to unvetted, improperly vetted sponsors. One of the investigations that they talked about in the hearing was with this NGO called Inside Endeavors. They were supposed to be protecting kids in Pico, Texas. And instead, they found that they were putting these male staff members in the rooms with females. And 150 of these teenage girls were taught to twerk. Apparently what some people call dance lessons, I call grooming.
Our interviews with contracted auditors at Endeavor's Pico, Texas facility revealed disturbing findings. Male staff had been found inside female dorm rooms. An employee had led 150 teenage girls in sexually explicit routines, dance routines, teaching them how to twerk on multiple occasions. A female over 18 had been shielded from ICE. Others nearing 18 were released early to avoid transfer to ICE. And auditors were blocked from reviewing child sponsor placements. These abuses are not unique to Endeavors. Similar patterns existed across multiple NGOs. Federal contracts had prioritized speed over safety and rewarded output over outcomes, conditions which cartels exploited.
What I think that even this committee still doesn't fully understand is that the way that these operations were conducted are so sophisticated, and it makes it almost impossible to trace a child, because if you are giving children to unvetted sponsors, it makes it almost impossible to then find those children. Hence why we have now hundreds of thousands of children still missing, unaccounted for, unable to locate. So obviously we need more thorough home studies and a higher level, much higher level of vetting in the future. But what about forensic audits of all of these receipts from these NGOs? Our government has not required that yet. And I think that Congress must act now to require them to provide receipts and halt future funding and subpoena them to provide these receipts immediately. And by receipts, I'm not just talking about suspected fraudulent transactions that are happening, because there's a lot of those. I'm talking about audits of these hotline calls. Were they logged? Were they recorded? Were they archived? How can they follow up to ensure that every child who made a phone call is properly followed up on? So this is where you come in. We need you guys to tag your representatives to get these changes made. These are common sense consequences. Like for the sponsors that have been abusive or negligent to these children, they have to be held accountable. We need to bring back the DNA testing, the background checks, and the thorough family vetting to make sure that these children are related to the people that bring them across the border. Without that, there's no way to reduce human trafficking and the abuse of these children, and there's no way to safely reunite them with their family members. Okay, so the biggest change that has to happen right now is that the ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, their programs, and the UC programs, the Unaccompanied Children programs, need to be relocated to DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. So I think where we really went wrong here in the Biden administration is designating these unaccompanied children programs to HHS, which, Health and Human Services are not a law enforcement agency. So they do not have the skills, they don't have the resources to actually deter human trafficking, to monitor it, to implement any sort of consequences or oversight. They're simply Health and Human Services. So if DHS is given the jurisdiction of these cases and the UC database, their portal, which has all of the records of these children, they can actually follow up and use the resources of law enforcement and deploy more officers, more special task forces to actually do something about this problem. But we can't get that done until Congress acts. So in addition to the changes that I just described that many people like myself have been advocating for, is that we need this administration's executive orders to be codified by Congress. That includes designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations, finishing the wall, complete overhaul of the refugee admissions program, and lastly, terminate birthright citizenship and enforce the Remain in Mexico policy. There's been a 2,500% increase in trafficking at the southern border. Hundreds of thousands of missing kids, exploited, raped children. We need to get these changes done. So please tag your representatives, tag lawmakers, influencers, anybody that you think could help elevate this message. I try to make it as short as possible so that we can really convey what needs to be done now.